Folks, I'm here to present to you Willow and James from School Factory, and they're going to be talking about linking and launching Earth-based hackerspaces, as you can see on the wall behind me. And please give a warm hand of applause for Willow and James.
Okay, so I'm going to try not to cast too much of a shadow on this. I'm Willow Brew. I'm from Jigsaw Renaissance in Seattle.
And I'm James Carlson from Bucketworks in Milwaukee. Started a hacker and makerspace there in 2002, before such words and terms had any meaning in most of the United States. And at the same time, started an organization called the School Factory, thinking that in the future there'd need to be something that replicated places like Bucketworks, places like Jigsaw. So school, because I think schools need to be reinvented in this century, and factory from the notion of the factory design pattern from software engineering.
So when I started Jigsaw Renaissance in Seattle years later, it was really nice to have a resource in someone who had already been through it. We had the design patterns, which was really nice, but it was also nice to have someone who had their membership documents, and this is what a lease should look like, and these are the sorts of insurance that we went through. And out of that, there were some other spaces that joined on, and we started the Space Federation.
So what we're going to talk about today are some of the things that we've noticed and kind of the reasons why we're doing this, why we do this sort of work. If you think about school, and school is very different across the world. In the United States, I'll just give you a quick example of kind of the ancient roots and ancient history of school. The rules from the Milwaukee Public Schools in 1864. The rule number one is, the pupils must appear at the appointed hours and be free from lice, itch, and scald head. Of course, probably a very timely rule in 1864, but what's really interesting about these rules is Rule 7, which says that students may not write, talk, or whisper to each other at all during school hours. They're just not allowed to talk as peers at all, which sounds just completely strange in the present day. But I also don't know if we've really come all that far. In most schools in the United States, social technology is not allowed. Students aren't allowed to use their phones. These sophisticated pocket computers we can use to study and scan the world, students aren't permitted to use them or learn about their use in school by school's effort. In a similar vein, the business community is struggling right now. Most companies are trying to find people who are talented and bring them on board so that they can grow their workforce and have good people working in the jobs. The challenge is that most of the organizations are based on a command and control model, which none of us wants to work in. We don't want to be in a hierarchy. We don't want necessarily to be in a structure that's very limiting and doesn't give us a chance to express our full capabilities as individuals. And in a similar way, the community struggles because individuals are wondering, where do I go to create, to make? Where do I go to build things? Do I have access to those resources? If you think of public libraries in the United States, many of them are closing or fading away as texts are becoming available online. And libraries, of course, don't usually have laser cutters and CNC machines and paintbrushes and pottery wheels, which are also tools people want to create with. So these are kind of some of the reasons why we're doing the work we're doing.
So I'm sure you all here know what a hackerspace is. But in America, it's sort of a new idea. And we also have makerspaces. Mitch says that makerspace is just for people who are scared of the word hacker. We tend to think it's a little bit more about physical objects rather than just electronic ones.
Neurons, bits, and atoms.
But we also have co-working spaces in the US, which are where people go for a slightly different way of interacting with the work environment.
These places are all very different across the country, but they have common values from what we've noticed in exploring them. Concepts of inclusion and welcoming people who are different, values of collaboration, values of hands-on work, and we've started to learn and identify a lot of the different spaces across the country and try and figure out what they all have in common, even though they're all very unique and very different. And Some of the spaces involved, like Bucketworks from 2002, mixing up all different elements, like a coffee shop next to a wood shop next to a computer lab, or Sector 67 in Madison, Pumping Station 1 in Chicago. Really interesting places with unique floor plans, unique kinds of communities. Make It Labs in New Hampshire, and Jigsaw in Seattle, again with just all different types of people and elements and community that are really significant and unique in terms of who uses them and why they go there.
And these are the spaces that we just zoomed in on are all part of officially the Space Federation, which we'll get into what that is in a little bit. But this is a little bit more in depth of what patterns we've noticed people go through in their spaces. So like Pumping Station 1 was already around for a year before it got involved with the Space Federation, but Sector 67 hadn't even gotten rented their first place yet.
And Bridgewire in Reno, Nevada, they joined a week before they signed their lease for their space. And so it's like the idea of, most of these hackerspaces, when they started in the US, started from the design patterns, started opening up, and were basically operating by themselves or on hackerspaces.org mailing list and so forth, and being able to actually talk to other people who are going through the same exact struggles and the same challenges at the same time frame is really helpful. So this is a schematic view of a hackerspace. The idea of, in the beginning, people need to discover it, find out that it exists in their city before they can get involved. How many of you have ever been to a Maker Faire in the US? Like a Maker Faire event? Yes. So, a lot of times there'll be 85,000 people who will go to Maker Faire. And we run a part of Maker Faire called Space Camp, where we put all the hacker and maker spaces in one area. And people come through with their families and their kids, and they come up and talk to the people who are part of the space, and they say, what is a hackerspace? Isn't that like, a place where Julian Assange hangs out and breaks into the government or whatever? And they don't even know these places exist. They don't even know where all the makers come from, where all the hackers come from. And so there's a lot of discovery that needs to be done just to show people that these things are out there. Once people become a member and start involving themselves in the community, we've noticed there's a few common characteristics, right? Some spaces have an onboarding process where people learn how to become a member, they learn how to use the equipment, they learn how to be a member of the community.
And if you have a way for people to really latch on to what you've created and what your values are, then they tend to stick around a lot longer and they self-select for your space or another space that's in the same city.
Then once in, a whole variety of different experiences become available to the members. As some of you participated, how many of you are members of a hackerspace? Okay, so that's just a few hands, but people are doing things together, having exhibits, galleries, projects, working on things, building stuff. We have some fun animation of soldering, right, which we all would do. Using common resources, power tools, laser cutters, table saws, or even just a table. Like I have a small place where I live, so I don't have enough room in my place to spread out a whole bunch of stuff that I want to work on. And such a common thing, like a big table, is a critical resource. It's useful to
And also a space free of cats who like to tackle the project that you're working on is nice.
And environments that are useful for different purposes. So, people need to practice, rehearse, do photo shoots, have meetups, meetings, and so forth. These common environments are made available to the members. But what's the point? Why have a hackerspace? Why have a makerspace? So that you can build things, right? So we've seen people building communities, creating new communities of practice, but also opening businesses. In Bucketworks alone, over I think about a 7-year period, there were 68 new companies created, but they weren't all for-profit companies. Some of them nonprofit, some of them social enterprise, some of them, technology startups, some of them not. And it's a real wide variety of those things. Creating art, it's another huge piece of it. And of course,
we still have to figure out how to pay rent.
Gas needs to be in the tank.
So when you have all these people doing incredible things and having resources that they've never had access to, you still have to somehow place a value on what they're gaining access to. And because we like to give so much and we're so excited that other people want to participate in this, it's really hard to say, and I need you to pay your membership dues. So that's something that a lot of spaces struggle with in a lot of ways.
And once members join, sometimes they also move on. They leave the city, they move to a different community. There's a way of spaces to basically honor a person who's left and to keep them in the extended community so that even though they may only have a certain number of members at a certain time, they still have a whole extended family of people that support the mission of the space.
So why do we think spaces are solutions to the problems we were talking about earlier with businesses, with schools, with lack of libraries, things like that?
We've been running panels at Maker Faire events and just talking to the people who run these spaces about what kinds of things they've learned. Because a lot of hackerspaces offer classes and programming to the community and the neighborhood around them. So at San Mateo, we had a panel. We had Mitch and Aesthetics from Noisebridge and Jimmy from Artist Asylum, just asking questions like, well, what happens when you teach a class at a hackerspace? What's the difference between that and doing it in a school? What's significant about this? Why is it special?
And it's special because people go there because they care to. Work, you have to go there because you have to, otherwise you don't get paid. You have to go to school because your parents are legally obliged to send you. Some of us like school. I actually really enjoyed my education, but I would have gotten much more out of going to a hackerspace because it's opt-in and because it's passion-based. You get to learn about the things that you love learning about because it's okay to break things. It's okay to fail. It's okay to be immersed in this crazy environment, and you're bombarded by all of these different cross-pollination of ideas, so you learn a whole lot more and you get excited about a whole lot more.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing we've heard and the common feature, obviously there are no grades at Hackerspace. You cannot get an A or an F, and that's probably a good thing because grades don't really effectively measure what people are really capable of yet. Maybe we as a community will invent some way of doing that. But the biggest thing is failure is okay. Like when we screw up in this community, we don't get punished for it. We just put it out in the open and everybody says, well, here's what you did wrong, and we talk about it and then we do it again and we get better at it.
We try to fail informatively, which also means that we have to document things, which sucks, but it's worthwhile.
Yeah, and this is something that's really missing. There is no place in most communities where it's failure friendly, where it's okay to make a mistake. And if you think about something as complex as learning how to etch a circuit board or learning how to paint a painting, where you're finding a source of inspiration within you, failing is a necessary thing. And yet there's no real celebration or honoring of failure in the wider culture. And so I think this is actually a key element of what hackerspace and makerspace communities can bring to the wider culture, is this friendliness to failure, this sort of openness to mistakes. The idea of deriving joy from creating something purely for the sake of making it, not because I had to or someone paid me to or I had to get an A or complete a grade or something of that kind. The idea that the roles between teachers and students are somewhat blurred. We're all people asking and teaching and sharing and doing at the same time. Whereas again, in most of the culture around us, those roles are fairly rigid and stratified and separated. And of course, the common values, right? I mean, these values like collaboration and transparency and sharing resources, not necessarily a part of the wider culture, more based on a scarcity.
So if you have to hold on to certain things because you're based on a scarcity-based economy, it means that you have to worry about property because there's only so much property to go around. And now we have issues with copyright and everything else. You have to worry about who owns an idea because I don't even know why you have to worry about these things anymore. But we're creating more of a resource-based economy where by giving more value, you end up getting more value and building on top of what other things have been created in the past, which means that it's also important to pull value and ideas out of our different generations.
Yeah, the other fun thing is that we look at these spaces, we're seeing intergenerational learning, which again, in most American schools, grades are very segregated by age. Whereas if you go to a typical hacker or maker space, you'll see teens and boomers and Xers and Y and all the different ages just interacting freely with one another, which is a better learning environment, certainly, and helps these different generations share knowledge between each other. Like the joke is, of course, you've got the boomers who are trying to understand how to use all this technology. And so the teens will show them how to use it, and the boomers will show the teens sort of why to use it. What's the purpose? Why would I want to share? What would be meaningful things to share? And the Gen Xers and the Gen Yers in the middle just kind of provide the acronymical translations so that the two generations can actually understand one another.
So, because we're such idealists and we still have to pay rent, we have to worry about creating new cultures and how we're going to shift from what we have now into where we're going. And we have to worry about the man in the fancy house, right?
Yes. The man who doesn't necessarily understand what kinds of places these are because they're new. It's like the Wright brothers trying to get a permit to fly a plane. How would you even get that? Money. Money is a big challenge. Every space needs it to pay rent, to buy gear, to get insurance, to do all these other things, and it's hard to get it because it's hard to explain what it's for. Governance. As we look at all these different spaces, they all have different ways of running the show. We're
all bringing in our cultural assumptions into these new spaces, and then we also have to figure out how to communicate with other people. Because most of us have been strange in some way to the people who have been around us. Not necessarily outcasts, but everybody's different, right? Everyone's a unique snowflake, but that means that we also have to figure out conflict resolution and how we're going to deal with other people within the structures that we create.
The NAICS is an official system, a taxonomy of business types in the United States. Probably every nation has these, where every kind of business, like a farm or a law firm or a restaurant, there's a number that goes with that, and that number enables that business to get things like insurance, like a permit, like whatever. Well, there's no such code for what these collaborative spaces are. We don't have a designation or an identification, and it makes it hard to do certain things.
And just about anything in the U.S. that's not a residence is counted as a business unless it's run by a government organization. So things like clubhouses are still counted as a business. So we're not saying that these operate as for-profit groups, just that we still have to have a little box to check.
Yeah, same thing with the inspectors from the city who come in and say, so what do you mean you're going to put a table saw here and let people use it 24 hours a day? I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with that. And in fact, the building that you're doing this in is actually zoned for people to, sit at desks and type on computers, not operate power tools. It's that kind of conversation that is hard to have. It's hard to explain to these folks who are, again, very procedural, I'm filling out a form.
It's like, no, just check multiple boxes. It'll be fine. They don't like that at all.
How many of you here have had the distinct pleasure of reviewing a commercial lease? Anybody? Yes. Isn't it fun? I wake up every day and read one just to freshen up my day. But again, we're finding that sometimes hackerspaces and makerspaces enter into a lease arrangement and the fine print can screw them in the end. There'll be like a line that says, if the roof is leaking, we're not going to fix it. And we come into the shop the next morning and find the CNC machines had water falling on it or something like that. Call the landlord, sorry, you signed a triple net lease. Triple net, what's that mean? Well, that means it's your problem. These are the things that we're trying to avoid hackerspaces having to go through.
First, we also have to worry about insurance. Not only telling your insurance agent that you're 24/7 and that you like power tools. So like 3 a.m., somebody's going to chop off a finger and you say, and we also like kids. We want the kids in the space. Like, next to the power tools, oh, we'll teach them how to use it first. It'll be fine. Like, no.
And then, of course, the bigger challenge of inviting the wider community, like letting people know in the community the space is there. How do we let them know? Marketing, advertising, that costs lots of money, which we don't have. So how do we get the word out? How do we let people know that this is here, it's a resource, you can use it?
And to me, this is the difference between what the first wave of hackerspaces were in the US and the current wave of hackerspaces, where the first wave was it's a high barrier to entry. You have to know what you're doing in order to participate. And you also have to know that it exists before you can participate. So in Seattle, There's a place where they play with fire all the time, flaming tetherball. It's an industrial arts area, but you can kill yourself. There's also a place where there are lasers and high voltage. Again, you can kill yourself, but these are sort of first generation of, you have to know that we're here before you can play. And what I feel like is going on right now with this movement towards more education is that you're saying, we love what we do, and you should too. You should come play with us. You should come learn with us. But it's really hard to figure out how to tell people that and not sound weird.
Especially to people that are kind of on the fence. You know, like we all come to events like this because we get it already. But it's the folks who, like at Bucketworks one evening, I got a phone call from this woman who said, you know, I've been staying home and taking care of my family for 10 years and just sort of doing the laundry and doing the dishes, but I saw on the web that you guys have paintbrushes and stuff, and would it be okay if I came down there and painted a little bit? Yes, hang up the phone right away. Don't even tell your family where you're going. Just get down here and create stuff. But it's those folks we want to reach because they're just on the edge. You know, they're ready to join, but they haven't figured out how yet.
And if we're going to impart the values that we share to the rest of everyone else so we don't even have to worry about insurance regulations, we have to figure out how to get everyone in first.
So that brings us to what we've been doing. The School Factory is a nonprofit organization, meaning in the States it's a 501c3, which means it's a public charity, so it's got to disclose its financial information, it's got to disclose who's leading it, it has to share information. We've taken that really far out, which we'll show you later, the kind of radical transparency, but there's two sides to what we do. One side we call the Space Federation, the other side we call Schools for Communities, and the Space Federation is really focused on the containers, the places, and how to make them stronger.
So back at our map, when we were talking about the spaces that were participating in this had to do with the first round of just saying, we will offer you nonprofit status, which gives you a legitimate place to exist in the social and legal structure of America.
So rather than being, you know, a brand new organization and going to someone and saying, please give us several $1,000s so that we can upgrade our kitchen in our space, you're going into that conversation with a 9-year-old organization at your back saying, yep, we're going to support this space so that you can take those donations on day one, as well as take cash and item donations. So a lot of these spaces, like, again, in America, there used to be a class you could take in school called shop class, where you'd learn how to use power tools and make things. Most schools don't offer shop class anymore, but the schools still have all the tools. And so what a lot of spaces are doing is going to the schools and saying, hey, give us your table saw, give us your drill press, but we need you to be a nonprofit in order to give that to you so that we can fill out the proper box and check the appropriate form. And so we just make it really easy for the spaces to get that status right away on day one.
We also get to help develop communities, because a lot of us have been inventing the wheel from scratch over and over again. And so we've started on the Make a Space kit, which does not aim to make an assembly sort of space, but just give you, like, the difference between a kit that you would solder here and IKEA furniture, they both include instructions, but it's nice to also have a community surrounding it about what you're doing, why you're doing it. Hey, I ran into this problem here, or hey, I modded this here, isn't that awesome? So
kind of the level of detail beyond what the hackerspace design patterns would say, and going into like the specifics of, in an American city, you need to get an occupancy permit. This is generally where to go get that. Be thinking about it. Don't not do it and then find out later. Like we did at Bucketworks, we were operating for 5 years before we had a permit to be there. The mayor had been over with his kids several times. No one really knew or cared that we didn't have that until finally an inspector came one day and said, you know, you really do need to have an occupancy permit to be doing this. Technically, I guess we were squatters, although we were paying rent, we had a lease, you know, all that other stuff. We just didn't know any better. So that's one of those things not to overlook.
And it's sort of the stuff that you just take care of to get it out of the way so that you can keep making awesome things, including friends.
The other aspect is mentoring and peer support. So the conversations between people like Willow and I who run hackerspaces and makerspaces about what we're dealing with on a daily basis.
So, for instance, there was a guy at Jigsaw who kept sleeping on the couch. And we were like, well, do we make another rule? Do we say it's okay to take naps? How long would a nap be? Would it be 20 minutes? Would it be 2 hours? Talked to a bunch of people. And finally, we deployed Rule 0 at Jigsaw, which is don't do anything that makes us make more rules.
Or the other example of, I want to join this space, person joins, they come on in, they set up their desk, they get all their computer stuff set up, and they decorate everything with porn.
And then you get into awesome conversations about the difference between erotica and porn, and well, is this a Rule 0 thing, or is this can we negotiate this?
And what happens if the space is family friendly? We want to support the free expression of all individual characteristics in art, yet we've got young kids coming over later. Can you cover up your porn, please? It's vital conversations. As we grow the Space Federation, we're adding some features to it in terms of what we want to do to help spaces. One of the big ones is fundraising. So raising money from grants is hard. In America, you can write a grant and a foundation will give you a donation to do something. So what we're doing right now is researching different ways of essentially providing central resources for grant writing and mentoring spaces. If they found someone that wants to give them money and can accept grant applications, helping them do it. Also helping the spaces get sponsorship from larger organizations, common resources, but doing it in a progressive and transparent manner, because a lot of times sponsorship has strings attached to it, and we want to cut those strings or keep them minimal so that spaces keep as much of the freedom and individual culture that they can. And then, of course, also help spaces across the country engage in really interspace collaborative projects. And the reason for this is that it's a lot harder for a space to raise money by itself. If it goes out and says, can we have $5,000 for this or $10,000 for that? It's a lot easier actually to say, give us $150,000 so that we can do 15 of these at once. And so that's sort of the approach we're taking. It's actually easier to ask for more than it is to ask for a little in some of these cases.
So a lot of what the Space Federation is about is centralizing and automating the parts that allow you to exist in what is now, the systems that are now.
Another big dimension is leadership development. Since the design patterns came out in 2007, and prior to that time, there were probably less than 60 hackerspaces in the US, and even in the world, perhaps. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge growth. And then there's a succession challenge, because the person that downloaded the design patterns and goes, I'm going to start a hackerspace, and does it. They rent the thing, they get the tools, they bring the members in, and about a year and a half later, they're going, oh my God, I'm so tired, and I haven't worked on my own projects at all for the last year and a half. I'm burned out. What happens then? How do we hand over the leadership of that space to a new group of people or a new person who can actually take it over and make it work? That's a sensitive time. A lot of spaces we've talked to actually don't make it through that, or there's a challenge, or they can't get enough people involved to help out.
We also have to worry about teaching people how to communicate with each other. Just how you get the leadership team to communicate within itself, how you get them to ask questions of necessary people, how you get them to communicate with the membership at large.
We've talked a lot of hackerspaces where there's a mailing list, there's a wiki, there's the website, they have Facebook, there's a Twitter, and so I'm a new member and I join and I'm trying to find out what's going on. Where do I go? Well, go to any of these 6 places. Well, which one? All of them. Not necessarily always a good thing for a community, especially going back to what we talked about earlier, when we're bringing people in who aren't quite sure what's going on but are curious and want to try it out. And then conflict. How do we deal with it?
Within the leadership team, within the membership, and between the two groups, which should sort of be the same group depending on if it's a consensus-based, like noise bridge, which is awesome. And how do you deal with that? What's important to the space and what's important to the people in the space and what's something being brought in from outside, and it's a big old mess.
Sometimes it's easier for outsiders to come in and say, let's make this conversation easier for everybody and really mediate between parties who are having a conflict. And conflict's real. It will happen in every social community. Advocacy. So this is really changing the law. This is going to bat with the man and saying, hey, you know what? We need to have, first of all, political allies in order to do what we're trying to do. People who will champion our cause when legislation comes up, when things are being discussed in courthouses and congresses and so forth, zoning restrictions, land use, all these different aspects. Bucketworks was located in Milwaukee in a place that's sort of between a very wealthy white community and a very poor black community. And we put it there because we thought, well, we could maybe bridge these two communities. Maybe these folks would actually start to talk to each other. Milwaukee is also a very racially segregated city. So we thought we could maybe get that to work out better as well. But the building we were in was zoned, defined as being used only for a specific kind of purpose, which was heavy manufacturing, which meant we couldn't bring kids there, we couldn't do these other things there, so we had to change the zoning. It's hard to do that stuff, especially when no one understands what you're trying to do because there's no category for this sort of organization anyway. And it's just an example. A lot of other spaces no doubt face that. The classifications, certification. We want to be able to go head to head with schools and say, listen, people who go to hackerspaces they learn way better than the folks who learn in a traditional school environment. But we've got to prove that somehow. We've got to actually measure it somehow and get certified to show that.
So there are people talking about doing emergent testing through machine learning, where depending on how you did on test 4 determines how good test 1 is, if that makes sense. And so you're able to slowly build better tests, which then will indicate how well you're learning a language or math.
And later, of course...
And I like machine learning, so it's cool.
Yes. And later, of course, once this is working better, we want to go back into the system of measurement that assesses our abilities and say, actually, this system is incomplete. Here's a better one that we hackers from all over the world invented. It's a richer description of what we've learned, what we're capable of. Insurance is another piece of this. We've been working with different insurance markets and brokerages in the US to help them understand what hackerspaces are, to sort of smooth the path so it's easier for those places to get insurance of all the different varieties of insurance that there are, and even understanding what kinds are needed.
There are also some guys from Make Magazine who want to start an insurance co-op, because that's what they always dreamed of when they were young. They're like, now we like using power tools so much that we need to form an insurance company so that someone will actually cover us, even if it's us.
And there's a whole legal precedent for doing that. In the US, you can create an insurance co-op. Technology, sort of separating. I mean, hackerspaces, makerspaces, totally all full of technologists, but some of them aren't. We've talked to a few that more on the creative side don't necessarily have the community members who can roll their own access control system so that their doors are digitally controlled and they can give out memberships to people that are 2 hours long or 24 hours long or whatever. Being able to share those types of tools, or member tracking, member database. Here's a way of tracking and organizing your members. Here's a way of doing project management and just basic communications. And also finding sponsors to give the space's technology, like hosting. You know, like here's a bunch of hosting that's donated, or here's internet that's donated, or what have you. Things that are commodities that aren't really all that unique from space to space.
The last thing we need to fail is the ability of your members to interact with the space itself through the technology that you've provided. So we automated our membership dues system in Jigsaw so that it's not a person saying, hey, can you pay your thing? Otherwise I need your key back. It doesn't work.
Right. Same thing with us. In fact, our access control system at Bucketworks was made by the folks at the Milwaukee Makerspace, which is probably 4 miles away. And so the whole system for 3 doors cost $500 compared to a commercial system where you might just add a 0 to get a rough idea of what the cost would be. But that allows us the flexibility of saying, yeah, you didn't pay, the door doesn't open. Or, hey, you know, from here in Germany, I could send someone an access code to get in and they'd be able to, and I don't have to make them a physical key. So it's just really handy stuff.
So it's called the Space Federation because I'm a Star Trek geek. It's more of just a group of people that all have the same sorts of ideals and are willing to throw into the same hat, but they're all still very individualistic. We don't have anything to do with their day-to-day operations, nothing like that. It's just a place for people to get together and talk to one another.
Yeah, we're really careful about not trying to make this like a franchise. We don't want to control the spaces at all. We just want to separate all the commodity problems from all the unique ones.
So in the same way that we share a CNC machine, we might as well just share insurance.
Schools for Communities is about what goes on in the spaces. And this is really focused more on looking for patterns that we see people doing in the different spaces that we can somehow build up a recipe for doing. And there's all sorts of existing recipes that we know about, but not every community knows how to do them equally well, and there's tons of different guides on how to do them. So a more intimate community can share things that really work, like the concept of an unconference, which is like what we're doing in bar camp and so forth. At Bucketworks, we've done bar camp, photo camp, draw camp, queer camp. I'm trying to think, we probably had a couple of others, but really trying to explore that pattern of bottom-up learning. Startup Accelerator, which is like an unconference for the beginning of something, like the beginning of a project or the beginning of a business or the beginning of an adventure. It's a tricky time, and there's a usefulness in gathering around that. Or the concept of the meetup, just getting together once a month to talk about Ruby or PHP or what have you. Some meetups are great, some really suck. Here's some ways to make them better. Here's some ways to make them work. Common agendas, common topics that might help people.
I like how angry this thick person is. He's like,
yes. You will learn PHP. The hackathon, getting people together to do something useful as a group or complete a bunch of projects together in a social sort of semi-party kind of environment.
So at Jigsaw, we have finish your project or get punched in the face hackathon. It's a good time. When you walk in, you designate both your project and your puncher. Lots of stuff gets done. I love it.
Another example is Geeks Without Bounds, which is hackathons to try to provide technology for a disaster. Like what would help a bunch of aid organizations create a common blood type database so that they could figure out where to get blood from. Because of course they all have their own silo.
Or just scrape it into an API so you don't have to deal with them quite so much.
The class, right? So the idea that, for example, here at camp, Mitch is doing the soldering and Arduino class, but that class pattern, that agenda and structure and schedule is something that'd be useful for a lot of places to know about. If someone invents a good class, comes up with a good structure for it, and can publish that in a way that other spaces can use it, we want to help spread that around as rapidly as possible and ultimately create a library of some of these things. So if I want to teach a class on a certain topic or take one, I can go online and find a recipe for how to do that. And then, of course, the festival.
Which is this.
Yes. But different examples of events where we're just celebrating what's been achieved. In Milwaukee, we started the Milwaukee Spotlight Student Film Festival. So it's high school student-focused, teen-focused movie film festival. And we got movies from all over the country. I think we got 68 movies from 11 states the last time we did it. And it's just great because it brought young people into these spaces and got them a chance to see what they could do too. And most of them had been, just going all out trying to make movies. Some of them coming from really poor communities where there's no equipment, and they were editing their video with 2 VHS decks, dubbing back and forth to create their work. And so they walk into a place where there's a bunch of adults who are like really excited about creating movies, and they have access to more equipment so that they can actually build different creative product. It's an awesome way to get the people who are on the fence, who are on the border, to get them involved. Is a festival, is something more open, or an art show, or a music show, or a robotics show, or something like that. So Schools for Communities is about trying to find all those best practices on the activity side. And that's really what the School Factory does, those 2 branches of it. If you want to add anything to that.
I'm good.
So why we want to talk to you about all this stuff? We want to get your feedback. Like, why is this important? Not just in the USA, but globally. Like, a fantasy of mine when I started the School Factory is like 2001 Space Odyssey. We're making this like black obelisk thing that we could drop onto a place like the Gaza Strip, or just anywhere where diversities are in conflict with one another. And the communities there could use this obelisk to unpack everything they'd need to make a space, a collaborative place, and have activities that they could do in it where they could actually heal some of those ills. So what does that mean? And what does it mean for the way we educate people in the future? If we're building a civilization that's based on engagement and transparency and collaboration and democratic principles that are applied between groups. How can these places help that go faster? How can we help get there quicker? If we're going to go and explore space, we're going to need the Earth to work out, I think, in order.
Or at least long enough to get us
Long
there.
enough to get there. Also, like, what's been working for you? If you're a member of a space or know of a place, what's been working? What have you noticed that doesn't work? And how could you help us build this? What can you offer to us? We want to ask you for that. But also, what do you need help with? If you know of a place out there in your community that could benefit from some of the things that we've learned, we'd love to know about that.
So let's take 10 minutes if you want. Does anyone have any feedback or questions right now?
So we're interactive.
I think yes, this gentleman has a microphone.
Looks like someone in the back there.
It's good. Just stand up and shout it for now. It'll work.
Okay, and if you have questions, please come to this microphone and talk into the microphone for all the people watching and listening in on the stream. And it's easier if you come to the microphone than if we have to bring that to you.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. My question is like, have you ever considered about the barrier in language? Because the situation is like that. I myself come from Beijing, China, and I'm now starting a new hackerspace in Beijing. There is only existing one, and I am also organizing a Maker Faire-like event in Beijing next April. So all these things happen in China. Like we are trying to attract as many people as possible, but most of them are Chinese, of course. And we are also want these kind of things to be like more international, more globally. So we actually invited some hackers, including Mitch Altman, to come to this event and hackerspaces. But here, what the problem I met is like most Chinese people, I don't know, not have that kind of level of English to communicate freely with the hackers from the globe. So that will like prevent this, I don't know, hackerspace federation or any kind of that thing. Have you ever considered about that?
Yes, we're thinking a lot about it. How do we deal with language?
Okay.
We'd like to, because we're from the States, that's where we're starting.
Right.
But absolutely love to get it out, and we've tried to find some people to help us translate some of these things that have been written into other languages. I think that would help.
We have some people in the U.S. who speak fluent French and German and I think Japanese, but it's a matter of just getting critical mass on that so that there are enough people around that you're not burning out the individuals who are willing to translate. But
it's important. I'd file that under a what we need, and if you know of resources who can help, we would love to talk to them.
Okay.
Other questions, feedback, commentary?
this is the stalling dance, by the way. That's what we call this.
I apologize because I came a little bit late, and Space Sound Federation, I'm not familiar with Space Federation, but I was wondering if you are familiar with the Space Generation. It's a global network of young engineers who are involved in space, and they were launched in 1999 from the United Nations. And if you're also collaborating with them, they have each year this Space Week from October 4th to October 10th is a Space Week event, because the United Nations, October 4th was Sputnik launch and October 10th was the ratification of the Space Treaty. So I was wondering if you are collaborating with them, or also Space Foundation. I know there's a big push, or the NanoRack is another company in America which do also a lot of outreach programs, but they do those nanoracks to bring experiments on board the International Space Station. And I know that from him that the NanoRack that the US NASA has great outreach project, that there's a lot of push also from the official side to not domestically but also globally, as you mentioned.
Yes.
If you don't think it a little further, once they establish some infrastructure, this infrastructure can be used also for other things, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great potential link, and just because the names are similar, we should certainly look at it. I mean, the vision is, what we're thinking is, if it's the year let's just say 2025, 2030, and people say school, and they point at something, they'll be pointing at a hackerspace. They won't necessarily be pointing at a school like we would think of today. That's sort of our fantasy vision of the future. They'll be pointing at a makerspace. They'll be pointing at a collaborative kind of place like we've described, and in that way, that infrastructure becomes useful to a whole civilization.
And if the things that come out of that get us into actual space, so if we go from spaces to space, then that's awesome. The plane here, we actually did the dippy thing and we hit 0G for a little bit.
It's awesome.
Yes, I want to go to space. But it's the difference between, we're talking about spaces as in this being a space versus space, right?
What other questions? Yes.
So I think it's really great that you're doing this. This is a really inspirational project. And I just had a thought that I've interacted with the unschooling movement a little bit in the United States, and I was curious if you guys had any interactions with them.
Yes. There's a number of organizations in the U.S. that are about unschooling or informed by unschooling. I think Ivan Illich is, of course, like the ancestral brain from which a lot of these ideas of D and unschooling have sprung. So Rethinking Schools is one of them. They're actually based in Milwaukee, so we work with them a little bit. There's an organization called the Great Lakes Constructivist Consortium that's about trying to teach schools how to use constructivism and projects in learning instead of sort of, tests and grades and assignments and things like that. Unschooling, also homeschooling. I think given the right mediation, hacker and makerspaces could be an awesome adjunct to homeschooling efforts, because a lot of homeschooling, it's very isolating, or they kind of, don't have a lot of social experience or don't get exposed to real world projects. So that's great. I mean, absolutely in line. Thank you. Other comments?
Just a comment on the language barrier. At Arts Reactor in St. Louis, probably one of our most popular classes is language classes. We've had an American Sign Language class that's in its, I think, 8th or 9th week. And we're starting up a Japanese class shortly. But the question I wanted to ask you is, one of the things we've struggled with is, despite it seems to be getting a little better at conferences like this, but the hacker community is still very largely a white male community. And do you guys have any thoughts on how to fix that?
A bunch. Number one, don't just do technology. That's one great way to not just have white males. Like at Bucketworks, there was a period of time where our membership was 65% female. Because we have a theater, so a lot of acting groups would come, and so a lot of women were in the groups. There was sewing equipment, there was food making stuff, and I'm not just casting along gender lines here. The diversity was the important thing. Supporting artists as well, not just hackers, but like actually having a place for an artist to work, having a pottery wheel, having an easel. You're going to bring in more diverse kind of participants, having public events, and actually going out to other communities. I mean, in Milwaukee, and I'll just use this example, I don't know what it's like in other cities, but very racially segregated. So I didn't know who the community leaders were in the black community. I had to go meet them and say, hey, I've got this resource, why don't you come play? And because I reached out to them, they did. And so that increased the colors. So it's like, you look at diversities and say, well, we've got skin colors, we've got ages, we've got interests, and we've got religions, and we've got sexualities, and we've got all these diversities. Try to invite communities from every single one of those as often as possible and explicitly go and outreach to them. And then you start to see your own community resembling the world that we're in.
We've also found that if you have instructors, if you have your leaders as a diverse group, that helps. It's difficult to do because I mean, like, I can speak as a lady that we're socialized not just to not be vocal about what we can do, we're actively socialized against it. And so while it feels awkward sometimes, actually seeking out those people and saying, we want you, you need to come and teach this class, we know that you know this, you need to come in. But balanced with, so in parkour we have fem jams sometimes, where it's an all ladies class, right? If you do it too often, people self-segregate. But if you do it often enough, people know that they're welcome. And it's kind of, you have to take an explicit attitude towards things and say, like, we know it's a problem. Come help us fix it.
When we did Queer Camp, which I think is,
that's a
not
risky
around
thing
anymore.
to Google on the internet.
When we did that event at Bucketworks, it brought a whole new group of communities in. It was just basically bar camp for LGBT stuff, and people got together and talked about sessions. There was talk about transgender stuff. There was talk about all sorts of things. And if you do things like that, think of the signal you're sending out into the world around you. The flag you're waving that says basically, we're welcoming, we're inclusive of differentness. And the rest of the world, that sort of flag it really stands out, because it's not about that. It's not about that. And the more we do that with our spaces, I think the more we're sending a signal that says, this is healthy, this is good. Because honestly, I don't know how we could get all the things we've invented and make, and certainly going to space without diversity, without that kind of inclusion.
My favorite double booking that ever happened at Jigsaw was a dorkbot along with a pasty making workshop. Pasty. Okay, so you know the covers? Those are called pasties, right? So making your own, like with googly eyes or lettuce or what have you. It was my favorite thing because it brought in a very different group of people, and they were in the same space at the same time, and we ended up like talking about, well, could you do a persistence of vision like with tassels swinging around? And we brought in the Dorkbot crew to solving these new projects. But balancing that with someone wanting to call our math meetup math porn, they're like, well, while we understand that means like good old-fashioned intellectual wankage, the rest of the community doesn't quite get that. And if you want to create a safe space, an explicitly safe space, you have to understand the cultural context of what's going on around you. Does that make sense?
Anyone else? We have 6 more minutes, and we want to give you a couple ways to participate. Final questions?
Awesome.
Okay, so we're going to show you a couple of ways you can engage with us as we wrap this up. We've set up, as I mentioned earlier, we're really trying to push the limit on transparency of how we run the School Factory. So we've made, how many of you have heard of Open Atrium? It's a collaborative, online, web-based project management sort of environment. You can go to any of these places online to see what we are up to. Schoolfactory.org is our website. Atrium.schoolfactory.org is where we manage all of this stuff. And so if I go there, you will see that we are doing this all kind of in the open. So our nonprofit organizations, projects, programs, activities are all here. And you can see, for example, right now, there's a group of people planning Bar Camp Milwaukee using Atrium. You can see that there are a variety of different hacker and maker spaces who are, again, members of the Federation, who are all kind of trying to manage and run their organizations here, like their leadership teams talk about it.
And because you see the activity of all the groups, I'll see that someone posted from Pumping Station 1, hey, this is going on, how do we fix it? I'm like, oh, I found this thing over here, and just pop a comment on it, and it's wonderful.
We're also working on, if you go to the Space Federation group, which is at atrium.schoolfactory.org/spacefed, you can see some of the conversations and some of the important information we've shared about, for example, how do I get fiscal sponsorship so I can take tax-deductible donations, and that kind of information is there. Also recommend checking out
Space kit.
The space kit. So this is where we've really tried to build out what is the project plan for how to open a space. We've got a 4-phase build process. It's basically, discovery, formation, launch, and then a perpetual outreach. You're just constantly trying to gobble up the rest of the community around you and get them involved. And what we've done is set this up as a wiki. So we're inviting you to come in and add as much as you can to this, help us define and articulate what this is and the details that you've learned from doing it in your own community if you've been involved. So examples of things like in discovery, getting a group of people to help and then figuring out where to put the space and then finding funding and then learning about your community. Maybe not in that order, right? Tell us what order it should be in. Make the corrections and help us to improve this for the benefit of anybody else who wants to try to do this.
So we're also going to have an official space camp in Milwaukee in January because we love being cold. And
Bucketworks is warm.
Bucketworks itself has a great steam system. It's awesome. But for space facilitators to get together and talk about things like, how do you exchange membership dues for labor so I can't pay all my dues, but I can come in and work without creating hierarchical systems? And how do you deal with the slump so after everyone comes in and establishes the space and there's all this energy and then everyone finishes their first project and realizes that they're surrounded by people and the dishes need to be done? How do you figure that out?
Yes.
So we're going to do that. We'll be at Maker Faire, New York. And there was one other thing that I'm forgetting. Maybe.
I think we did good. Their brains look kind of full at this point.
Okay.
Thank you so much for giving us your attention and time. We appreciate it.
Do a high five?
Thank you, Willow and James. For the audience, just for information, in this room there will be the next talk in half an hour, and it will be giving away motivation. And you're invited to come back.